Under the scorching midday sun in Madrid's Plaza Mayor, the crowd held its breath as the famous millionaire stepped out of his luxury car. But his face froze. From a taxi across the street, his ex-wife, whom he'd abandoned without a word to chase a mistress, got out with a determined stride. Her hair whipped in the wind, and her serene yet icy gaze sent a chill down his spine. Then, a murmur swept through everyone as they saw that walking beside her was a 7-year-old boy with the same face, the same eyes, and the same smile as him. She held the little boy's hand tightly and advanced directly toward him like a verdict. The past never sleeps, and now the price to pay was just beginning. A quiet absence. Alejandro Varela arrived home late, his coat still unbuttoned, and his phone vibrating in his pocket. In the hallway, the scent of wax and fresh-cut flowers mingled with a silence that belonged not to a young home, but to a museum. He turned on a lamp, left his keys on the console, and saw a bowl of soup on the dining table, covered with a plate, still warm. On the fridge, a post-it note from Isabel said she had gone to rest for a bit. It was almost 10:30, the usual dinner time in Madrid, but that time, so typical of the city, had become an excuse in his house. Every night seemed to justify itself. The clock marked the end of another workday and the beginning of a distance. A video call with investors from Silicon Valley would occupy the slot between 11 and midnight. His assistant had scheduled the meeting without much consultation, as if Alejandro's private life were a secondary agenda. He took off his coat, poured himself some water, and went into his study. On the screen, his reflection looked impeccable. Dark suit, light shirt, that millimeter-precise haircut that gave him an air of unalterable order. He adjusted the camera, checked the neutral background, and prepared his international business smile. Before connecting, he looked toward the hallway to see if he could hear footsteps. But the house remained still. Isabel had been sleeping poorly for months. The pregnancy was going well, according to her doctor, but the nights were long and the days a bit heavy. When she heard Alejandro arrive, she waited a few minutes to see if he would come into the room. He didn't. She carefully got up, put on a robe, and crossed the hall barefoot. She found him with his back to her, headphones on, speaking English and moving his fingers as if playing a piano. She got close enough to hear scattered words. Return, round, closing. He saw her in the corner of the screen and raised a hand to greet her without breaking the conversation. Isabel, with a gentle gesture, placed a hand on her belly as a response. She went back to the kitchen, warmed up the soup for herself, and by instinct served another cup that she left covered. Marina appeared the next day with a dress she had just finished. She carried it in a garment bag, delicate and cheerful, with a print that seemed to promise Isabel outings that didn't exist. Marina gave her friend 2 kisses on the cheek and offered a smile that the years had not eroded. She also brought freshly baked bread from a Malasaña bakery and a small box of anise-flavored donuts. They sat in the kitchen with a jug of water and some lemon slices. They talked about names, cribs, and breastfeeding schedules. Isabel mentioned that Alejandro was coming home late, that he slept little, and that his phone no longer knew silence. Marina listened with that attention that doesn't interrupt. In the end, she suggested they go out one day for hot chocolate and churros at a cafe on Serrano Street with outdoor heaters. At this time of year, people enjoyed the blankets the waiters offered, and the steam from the cup seemed like a sign of life. Isabel laughed, accepted the idea, and promised to let her know. That afternoon, Alejandro reviewed reports for hours. When he finally stopped, he noticed a weariness in the back of his neck that he didn't remember from his 30s. When ambition and body once moved at the same speed, he now felt his head was ahead, and his heart was left behind. He peeked into the bedroom to ask Isabel if she wanted to go out to dinner. She was sleeping on her side, with one hand on her belly and the other under her pillow. The bedside lamp was on with an open book. Alejandro turned off the lamp, arranged the comforter, and stayed for a minute looking at his wife's profile, trying to remember the last time they had strolled without a hurry. Maybe one afternoon in the Retiro Park, before video conferences took over Sunday. He closed the door carefully. He didn't want to wake her. In the kitchen, he again found the soup she had left for him. He drank it standing up, with his back to the window, as if chewing while sitting down was a waste of time. The next day was more of the same. Back-to-back meetings, a working lunch that ended up being a hurried coffee, and in the afternoon, a quick visit from Isabel to the clinic for a routine checkup. Marina accompanied her. The two came out with good news and a prescription for rest, low salt, and short walks. On the way back, they stopped at a cafe with a zinc counter, one they had known since university. The waiter called them by name and served them 2 cortados and a slice of tortilla. They paid by leaving a few coins, as always, without ceremony, and said goodbye with a "take care" that sounded like home. At home, Isabel left the clinic card on the table with the next appointment underlined. Next to it, she placed a tiny white cotton onesie she had bought at a corner store. She took a photo of it with her phone to send to Alejandro. Not with reproaches, but with that excitement that needs to be shared. She wrote few words, no speeches. Sometimes an image was enough to remember that life also happened outside the screen. Alejandro received the photo while preparing for another meeting. He opened it and felt a pang of tenderness that pierced his armor. He saw himself reflected, for a second, in a mirror that wasn't the one in his office, but the one in the kitchen, with a baby in his arms and a table with breadcrumbs. He blinked, put his phone away, and thought about writing something to Isabel. He looked at it again and saved it for later. Always later. It was his favorite word when he didn't know how to find the first one. As evening fell, the temperature dropped a couple of degrees. From the living room balcony, you could see the row of bare trees on the street. Isabel sat on the sofa with a blanket and a chamomile tea. She listened to the radio for a while. A program called Friendly Voices told stories of people reuniting at Christmas. She smiled with that mix of nostalgia and hope that sometimes look alike. She turned off the radio to better hear the silence of her own home. She imagined Alejandro as a child in Seville, running through a courtyard, telling someone about the first time he dreamed of building something big. He had succeeded. Now he needed to learn to build inside, not just outside. At 9:30, Isabel felt like going for a short walk. She bundled up, went downstairs, and walked slowly along Serrano, watching older couples still holding hands, young people with shopping bags from stores that were closing, families arguing about where to have dinner. Passing an illuminated cafe, a waiter shook out tablecloths, and another collected a few coins of tip left next to the bill. She asked for a chocolate to go. They also offered her a couple of churros. She said yes, she would eat one now and save the other for when her husband arrived. She walked back with the steaming cup and a sweet smell that made her think of childhood. Alejandro was in front of his computer again. On the street, a car braked and someone spoke loudly. But from the study, the world often seemed soundless. He received a message from his team with an attached document and downloaded it. He read it in one go. Then, for no clear reason, he opened the photo folder on his phone. He saw the image of the white onesie again. He zoomed in and focused on the tiny stitching, the button, the fragility of the things that truly hold a life together. He closed his eyes. He promised himself that when the 11 o'clock call was over, he would go to the room. He would wake Isabel up just to tell her they had done the right thing, that this future deserved a new agenda. He didn't know that sometimes fate walks in through the same door that willpower walks out. Isabel arrived home with the chocolate already lukewarm. She went upstairs slowly, left the cup in the kitchen, and rested her forehead against the window pane. The streetlights seemed to move to their own rhythm. She placed her hand on her belly and spoke softly to herself. "You're doing well," she told that version of herself that sometimes doubted. Then she turned off the light and stayed, looking at the reflection of her silhouette in the darkness. The wall clock chimed twice. The sound of an elevator and then a door closing on another floor was heard. The world went on as always. She took a deep breath, went back to the living room, and sat down again by the window. Alejandro took a break between emails to glance at the living room. He saw the cardboard cup on the counter and smiled. He thought about warming up the chocolate and taking it to the room. A brief vibration distracted him. He looked at the screen. He didn't recognize the number. He hesitated for a moment. He opened the message. Isabel stays watching out the window. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Alejandro receives a message from a woman named Lucia. "See you tonight at the Prado." Do you think Alejandro is genuinely trying to reconnect? Or is he just succumbing to the pressure of a new phase of life? The unspoken promise. Under the warm lights of the Prado Museum, the low murmur of high society mingled with the soft notes of a string quartet. Guests arrived in dark coats and neatly tied scarves. They handed invitations with their names to the door staff and passed through the lobby where the marble shone, as if it held a secret. Alejandro Varela greeted them with a slight nod. He thanked the event curator in a low voice, and, as his coat was taken, he took a deep breath of the faint scent of wax and old paper. He hadn't come for the art, or at least not only for that. He was called by his last name at the entrance to the gallery, offered a glass of cava, and he replied with a polite, "Thank you," that sounded automatic. The agenda of donations and sponsorships was clear. He would sign his name as so many times before, but tonight the museum seemed more alive than ever, and the music enveloped the paintings with a kind of heartbeat. A few meters away, Lucia Ortega chatted with two event suppliers. She wore a red dress that drew attention without being loud, a simple hairstyle that revealed the nape of her neck, and small earrings that caught the light. When she saw him, she said goodbye with a smile and headed towards him with a confident stride. "Good evening, Alejandro," she said, and the way she pronounced his name sounded like an old agreement that had yet to be signed. He returned the greeting with courtesy and a spark of curiosity he wouldn't want to admit out loud. They exchanged a few phrases about the setup, commented on the generous attendance of patrons, and the naturalness with which Madrid adopted the custom of late dinners, even in museum spaces. Then, Lucia leaned toward a Goya painting and, without looking at Alejandro, made a light joke about the irony that resides in certain portraits. He laughed more than he should have, not because of the joke itself, but because of the relief of talking about something other than investment rounds. They walked through the gallery at a leisurely pace, greeting an elderly couple who recognized Alejandro from the business news with a good evening, and stopping in front of a canvas where the brushstroke seemed to breathe. Lucia avoided talking about her personal life with such a polished naturalness that it invited questions. She revealed almost nothing except that she liked a job well done and couldn't stand improvisation at an event. As they walked, he noticed how the conversation found a parallel melody to the quartet's, as if each comment about a painting opened a crack through which a breeze of complicity entered. Sometimes Lucia looked at him sideways with a calculated calm. Other times she would stop and let him make the first comment, as if she wanted to hear what kind of man was hiding behind the signature so many people sought. The museum, at that hour, seemed like a miniature city, with its silent streets between rooms and its luminous squares in the open spaces where drinks were served. A waiter approached with a tray of canapés. There was finely sliced Iberian ham, cubes of manchego cheese, small toasts with anchovy, and a warm cream in little glasses. Lucia chose something light, thanked him with a smile, and returned to the conversation with the ease of someone who knows how to move in all rooms. The attentive staff invited the attendees to visit the inner courtyard, where a small cocktail bar had been set up. They offered a classic mix, a well-served vermouth with a slice of orange and a green olive, and Alejandro accepted a sip that brought back a vague memory of his first years in Madrid. It was cold in the courtyard, but the heat lamps and the laughing people created a warm bubble. He thanked the waiters with a gesture and left a small coin in the tray meant for event donations, a symbolic gesture that wasn't meant to be seen. Lucia suggested they continue their walk through the next room, and the conversation, without drawing attention to itself, touched on the personal. They talked about impossible schedules, about how the city speeds up in autumn, about friends they saw less than they would like. Alejandro, almost without wanting to, mentioned that it had been a long time since he had been in a museum, without looking at the time. She responded that time was worth more when you learned not to chase it. She didn't say it in a preachy tone. She said it as if she were testing the water temperature. They laughed again at an observation about a group of guests who were photographing a sculpture with too much insistence, and he felt that rare gratitude of not forcing anything, of common language appearing on its own, as when one recognizes a melody. The quartet changed its piece, and the murmur quieted down. It was time for short speeches. The curator thanked the companies, mentioned Alejandro, and several heads turned toward him. He raised his glass in a gesture of respect, without excess. Lucia watched the gesture with a serene, non-invasive attention. At the end of the applause, she suggested they go to the quieter cocktail bar inside, and he accepted. There, the light was warmer. Conversations created a gentle backdrop. The barman asked for their preferences and prepared something soft. Lucia took a sip and leaned in just enough to tell him, in a confidential tone that hid no trap, that there was a restaurant in Salamanca he should get to know with her. She didn't say it with urgency. She said it like someone who opens a door and waits, politely, on the other side. Alejandro experienced that strange mix of relief and alert. He knew what such an invitation implied on a night like this, where formalities offered refuges that could become shortcuts. He responded with a light joke that didn't avoid the intention. She smiled, made a comment about the seasonal menu and the service that, she said, understood the cadence of a leisurely dinner. They talked about food, small plates, freshly baked bread, Madrid's taste for prolonging the after-dinner conversation. The ease with which they shared notes on wine bars and winter terraces showed that both knew the city well when the temperature dropped. They went back into the room. The museum framed each step with a quiet glow. An official photographer took a couple of snapshots and moved away. A collector approached to say hello. There was an exchange of cards, 2 polite phrases, a vague promise to meet at another opening. Lucia never lost the thread. When they were alone again, she allowed a pause that he interpreted as a wait. So Alejandro decided not to disguise his answer. He nodded his head and agreed to see her outside the event circuit. They started by exchanging numbers. She wrote slowly, verified the name, showed him the screen to confirm, and saved the contact. He did the same, feeling the small weight of the decision in his pocket. A museum assistant announced that a short documentary on the restoration of a work was being screened in the adjoining room. They walked over, sat in the dim light, and shared 15 minutes of images and voiceovers explaining how the skin of a painting is recovered when time and dust have covered it. Alejandro liked the metaphor, although he didn't name it, and Lucia perceived the comfortable silence of two people who weren't in a hurry to fill the air. When the screening ended, they returned to the lobby. Some guests were saying goodbye. The staff collected glasses. The music gave way to a gentle echo. In the cloakroom, she retrieved her coat. He did the same. They said goodnight with a closeness that needed no promises, and parted ways on the steps, each toward a different taxi. The Madrid night breathed that cold air that quickens the skin. The drivers asked where to. The museum doorman closed with a practiced motion. Alejandro got into the car with the feeling of having crossed a threshold, and he didn't deceive himself by thinking it had just been a cultural visit. He looked out the window as if the buildings could advise him, and found himself lighter than when he had arrived, which wasn't always a good sign when one was returning home. In the seat, his phone vibrated with minor notifications that he ignored for a few minutes. Lucia, in her taxi, looked at the lights of the Paseo del Prado and allowed herself a gesture of discreet satisfaction. The driver was listening to a late-night radio show. The hosts talked about the concerts scheduled for the weekend, and the city seemed to rock. As Lucia drove away, Alejandro received a message from Isabel. "Good night, the baby kicked today." Is this a missed opportunity for Alejandro, or is it a new beginning? How do you think the news about the baby will affect his choices? An unspoken challenge. The next morning dawned in Madrid with a clear sky and a cold air that invited a brisk walk. In the small cafe on Alcalá Street, the aroma of freshly ground coffee mingled with that of toasted bread. Isabel arrived punctually, wearing a light gray coat and a wool scarf her mother had knitted years ago. She sat by the window, where the sun came in at an angle, and ordered a coffee with milk and toast with tomato. She had chosen that place not only for its proximity to the office where she worked, but because from there she could watch people pass by, as if the city were telling her stories in silence. As she stirred her coffee, she mentally reviewed what had happened the night before. The strange feeling the message sent to Alejandro left her with, and the certainty that something was about to change. Lucia arrived a few minutes later. She wore a camel coat, and her hair was loose, in soft waves. She came in, greeting the waiter with a kind "good morning," and as soon as she saw Isabel, she smiled and approached her table. Isabel stood up to greet her, a kiss on each cheek, the typical greeting, and she offered her a seat. The conversation started light, with comments about the cold, the traffic, and the taste of the cafe's coffee. However, underneath those words, a subtle tension floated, as if both knew they hadn't gone there just to catch up. Lucia ordered a green tea and a half toast with bitter orange marmalade. Then, without beating around the bush, she asked about Alejandro. Isabel feigned surprise, but not convincingly enough. She replied with caution, saying she had seen him on the news at some cultural event, without adding details. The chat went on with sips and long pauses. Lucia mentioned that Alejandro seemed different lately, less distant, more attentive. Isabel, hearing this, felt a pang in her chest. It wasn't jealousy, but a mix of nostalgia and caution. She decided to change the subject and asked about Lucia's job, which consisted of organizing events for select clients in Madrid. Lucia talked about an upcoming event at the Palacio de Cibeles, describing the flowers she planned to use and the live music. As she spoke, Isabel watched her carefully, looking for signs, mentally comparing the image she had of her with the woman in front of her. She found no hostility, but a clear determination, that of someone who knows what she wants and isn't afraid to go for it. Outside, the street was bustling with pedestrians. The waiter came by to drop off another round of drinks. Isabel thanked him with a smile and left some coins as a tip on the tray. The gesture, simple, revealed her habit of taking care of small details. At that moment, Isabel's phone vibrated on the table. It was a message from Alejandro, asking if she was free for lunch. Isabel looked at it for a few seconds before replying with a brief, "I can't today. Another day." She put the phone away and noticed how Lucia, without apparent intention, had followed the movement with her gaze. They made no comment, but the silence that followed had a weight that neither wanted to acknowledge. Lucia resumed the conversation with a comment about the approaching Christmas holidays. She said that Madrid in December had a unique charm, with the lights on Gran Via and the markets in Plaza Mayor. Isabel nodded, remembering years when those walks were as a couple. She promised herself not to let melancholy dictate the tone of the meeting. So she talked about family plans, about her mother, who insisted on making homemade roscón de reyes, and about how in her neighborhood they always organized a small parade with music and hot chocolate for the children. Lucia listened with genuine interest, and for a few minutes, the conversation seemed to be freed from any tension. But soon, reality peeked out again. Lucia, in a tone that was meant to be casual, asked if Isabel was still in contact with Alejandro for personal matters. Isabel, looking out the window, replied that life sometimes forced people to cross paths, but that it didn't mean anything. The tone was calm, but her hands, clasped around her cup, revealed the opposite. Lucia didn't insist. She changed the subject to the restoration of a historic building where her company worked, describing with passion how each tile was cleaned by hand and how the artisans were careful not to lose a single original detail. Isabel let herself be carried away by the description, even asking about the suppliers, as if that way she could keep the conversation away from uncomfortable topics. The waiter offered them homemade sweets. Lucia chose a piece of almond cake. Isabel preferred not to have any more. The midday light began to fill the cafe, and some tables were left empty. It was time for each of them to go their separate ways. They got up, bundling up, and walked together to the door. Outside, the cold air made them adjust their scarves. Isabel said she had to go back to the office. Lucia mentioned that she had to meet with a supplier in the Salamanca neighborhood. They said goodbye with a handshake more formal than the initial greeting, a clear sign that the conversation had left more questions than answers. As Isabel walked away down the sidewalk, she felt that the conversation had stirred something she would have preferred to leave still. She knew that Lucia was not a direct threat, but also that any link to Alejandro could alter the fragile balance she had achieved in her life. She walked to the subway, wondering if she should tell her mother about this encounter or keep it to herself. For her part, Lucia watched Isabel walk away and stood for a few seconds at the cafe door, as if she wanted to memorize the scene. Then she turned and walked in the opposite direction, mentally reviewing what she had said and what she had kept silent. On the corner, a street musician played a soft melody on his guitar. The sound mingled with the noise of the cars and the city's murmur. Isabel, going down the subway stairs, once again felt the weight of the not-quite-answered message from Alejandro. Lucia, walking toward her appointment, allowed herself a small smile, not of victory, but of recognition. Something had moved. Neither of them knew yet where that current would take them, but both had a feeling that it would not be easy to ignore. In the subway, the train arrived with its metallic roar, and on the street, the winter light reflected off the facades, as if Madrid were ready to witness it all. What do you think is Isabel's biggest concern right now? The potential for a new relationship between Alejandro and Lucia, or the disruption to her carefully built new life? A second chance. That afternoon, Madrid's sky was covered with low clouds that foreboded rain. Alejandro, after an exhausting day in his office on Paseo de la Castellana, decided he needed a moment of fresh air and clarity before returning home. He walked aimlessly until he found himself in front of the old bookstore where he used to go as a young man, a place he hadn't visited in years. The window display showed luxury editions of Spanish classics, along with old maps and sepia postcards. He went in. He greeted the owner with a slight nod and began to walk through the narrow aisles, stroking the spines of the books as if they were old friends. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, but the calmness of the place helped him organize thoughts he had been avoiding for weeks. Among them, the insistent presence of Isabel in his memory, and the uncomfortable memory of his last conversation with Lucia, in which, without meaning to, he had hinted that he still thought about his ex-wife. As he flipped through a volume of poetry by Antonio Machado, he heard his name. It was Enrique, a university friend he hadn't seen in at least a decade. The greeting was warm, with a long hug and slaps on the back. They caught up quickly, talking about work, their families, how the city had changed. Enrique, learning that Alejandro was alone, insisted on inviting him to dinner that night at his house, where his wife and some mutual friends would also be. Alejandro hesitated, but finally accepted, thinking that such an evening might distract him from the tensions that had been haunting him lately. Dinner at Enrique's house was cozy. A spacious apartment in Chambéry, decorated with wooden furniture and warm rugs. The table was set with care, candles lit, and glasses of red wine waiting to be filled. The conversation flowed between anecdotes and laughter, but Alejandro, although he smiled and participated, felt a persistent knot in his stomach. During the second course, Enrique mentioned in passing that he had seen Isabel a few days ago at a charity event. He said it without malice, but it sparked the curiosity of the others present. They asked if he and Isabel still spoke, if there was a possibility of reconciliation. Alejandro responded with evasiveness, saying that time had passed and that each of them was going their own way. However, those words rang hollow. He knew they weren't entirely true. At the end of the evening, when the guests began to say goodbye, Enrique accompanied him to the door and spoke in a low voice. He reminded him how, in his youth, Alejandro had made mistakes that had cost him friendships and opportunities, but that he had always had the ability to correct them. He suggested that, if there were still unresolved issues with Isabel, he shouldn't let any more time pass. That brief conversation, almost a fraternal piece of advice, was etched in his mind on the way back home. The rain had started to fall, fine and constant, tinging the illuminated streets with reflections. Alejandro, instead of calling a taxi, decided to walk. He passed by Plaza de Colón, with its flags waving in the damp wind, and continued until he reached a small cafe that was still open. He went in, ordered a black coffee, and sat by the window, watching people run for shelter. He took out his phone, hesitated for a few seconds, and then wrote a message for Isabel. "We need to talk. Just a few minutes, when you can." He didn't send it immediately. He saved it in drafts and reread it several times, as if he feared the words were too much or not enough. As he drank his coffee, he remembered the first time he met Isabel at a book fair in Plaza Mayor. She was flipping through a volume of poetry, and he approached her to recommend an author. The conversation led to a walk through the city that ended in an impromptu dinner. That naturalness and closeness had been lost over the years, replaced by silences and reproaches. He wondered if any of that was left in them, or if time had erased everything. Leaving the cafe, the rain had stopped, and a fresh scent filled the air. Alejandro walked to his apartment in the Salamanca neighborhood, went up the stairs slowly, and stopped in front of the door. Before going in, he took out his phone and, without thinking any further, sent the message he had left in drafts. He closed his eyes for an instant, as if expecting an immediate reply. But silence was his only companion. Inside, he turned on a floor lamp and poured himself a glass of wine. He sank into the sofa, mentally reviewing the last few weeks. The casual encounter with Lucia, Enrique's words, and, above all, the image of Isabel smiling at some event, oblivious to his thoughts. He knew that approaching her meant reopening wounds, but he also felt that not doing so would be a burden that was already becoming unbearable. That night, as the city fell into a silence, interrupted only by the distant hum of traffic, Alejandro made a decision that he knew would set the course for the days to come. He didn't know if Isabel would agree to see him, or what she would say if she did. But he was clear that he had to try. The fear of failure was great, but greater was the certainty that there was still something to be said. Inside, a mix of anxiety and hope began to take shape, like a faint thread that might perhaps weave a bridge between what they were and what they could become. When he turned off the light and got ready for bed, his phone was still silent. There was no reply from Isabel. However, that lack of an answer didn't completely discourage him. He knew that sometimes words take time to find their moment, and that patience might be his best ally. Outside, the moon appeared between the clouds, dimly lighting the wet streets, and in his mind, the echo of Enrique's voice kept repeating, "Don't let any more time pass." What do you think is Alejandro's biggest fear in trying to reconnect with Isabel, and what would you advise him to do? A bridge to Toledo. The next morning, the sun rose with a gentle warmth that bathed the rooftops of Salamanca. Alejandro woke up early, more from restlessness than from habit, and prepared a strong coffee as the city slowly woke up. The silence of his apartment contrasted with the hustle and bustle of the street, where neighbors went to work, and the first customers entered the corner bakery. He checked his phone once more, looking for a reply that hadn't arrived. However, something inside him told him not to wait. He decided it was time to take a more concrete step. He took his car keys and drove to Toledo, the city where Isabel had lived since they separated. The road, surrounded by golden fields and gentle hills, allowed him to reflect on what he was going to say. He remembered the times they had traveled there together, walking through the cobbled streets and stopping for hot chocolate and churros in Zocodover Square. Those memories brought him a mix of nostalgia and melancholy. He didn't know if Isabel would receive him with crossed arms or with a cold look, but at least he wanted to show her that his intention was sincere. Upon arrival, he parked near the cathedral and walked to a small bookstore cafe where he knew she often spent her mornings. The place was decorated with wooden shelves, marble tables, and large windows that let in the light. The aroma of freshly ground coffee and old paper immediately enveloped him. Isabel was there, sitting by a window, with an open book and a steaming cup in front of her. Her hair, slightly tousled, fell over her shoulders, and she wore a burgundy scarf that he remembered well. Alejandro approached slowly, fearing that a sudden movement would break the moment. When she looked up, the surprise on her face was evident. She didn't smile, but she didn't ignore him either. With a slight gesture, she indicated the chair in front of her. He sat down, trying to hide his nervousness. The conversation began with short, almost formal phrases, questions about her health, work, the weather. Neither of them mentioned the past immediately, as if the weight of the years demanded a detour before entering delicate territory. It was Isabel who broke the circle. She asked why he had shown up without warning. Alejandro responded with honesty, confessing that he had been thinking about all that was left unresolved between them, and that he felt the need to talk, even if he didn't know exactly where to begin. She listened in silence, her eyes fixed on her cup. Then she told him that wounds don't disappear with just words, that time helps, but it doesn't erase. Her words were firm, but there was no resentment in her tone. Alejandro took advantage of that opening to talk about his mistakes, about the pride that had marked the last years of their relationship, and how, since their separation, he had understood what truly mattered. He wasn't trying to justify himself, but to acknowledge that he had failed. Isabel watched him with a mix of attention and skepticism. Finally, she told him that she had learned to live without expecting anything from him, and that she wasn't sure she wanted to stir up everything she had already rebuilt. The conversation was interrupted when a small child ran into the cafe, chased by his mother. The child tripped and was about to fall, but Alejandro got up and held him by the arm. The gesture was automatic, but as he sat down again, he noticed that Isabel was looking at him in a different way. She didn't say anything, but her eyes seemed to recognize a side of him that she thought was forgotten. They decided to go for a walk through the historic quarter. The narrow, steep streets were full of tourists, but they walked without a hurry, talking at times and falling silent at others. They passed by the San Martin Bridge, from which you could see the Tagus River gleaming in the sun. There, Isabel told him that she had been working on a community project to restore an old house and turn it into a cultural center. Alejandro was genuinely interested. He asked questions, and for the first time in a long time, the conversation flowed without tension. When they stopped in front of a viewpoint, he asked her if she would be willing to give him a chance, not as a couple right away, but as two people who share a past and who might be able to build something new. Isabel didn't reply immediately. She looked out at the horizon, took a deep breath, and said that she couldn't promise anything, but that she agreed to see him from time to time. It was a small concession, but Alejandro felt it was an intimate victory. Before saying goodbye, they went into a pastry shop where they bought marzipan to take with them. She insisted on paying, and he didn't argue. He walked with her to her doorway. There, the moment of farewell was brief. A handshake that lasted a second longer than usual, and a look that said more than words could. Alejandro walked away with his heart racing, knowing that the door wasn't completely closed. During the drive back to Madrid, he felt that something had changed. It wasn't an immediate reconciliation, but it was a first step. He remembered Enrique's words and how that afternoon in the bookstore had marked the beginning of this search. Now, at least, there was a bridge built, even if it was fragile. In his mind, he began to plan small gestures to show Isabel that his interest was real and that it was not a passing whim. Upon arriving at his apartment, he left the bag with marzipan on the table and poured himself a glass of wine. He looked out the window at the city lights and thought that patience would be key. He also remembered that there was something else he had to resolve. The distance with his own brother, with whom he had had a big argument years ago, and with whom he hadn't spoken since. If he truly wanted to fix his life, he would have to start by rebuilding all his important ties, not just the one he had with Isabel. He lay down on the sofa, letting the soft music fill the living room. The echo of the conversation with Isabel still resonated in his head, along with the image of her in the cafe, with that burgundy scarf and the golden light entering through the window. He felt that there was still hope, and that, although the road would be long, it was worth traveling. At some point, before falling asleep, he decided that the next step would be to surprise her with a visit to that cultural center where she worked, not to impose his presence, but to show her that he was willing to share her interests and her world. Outside, the night closed in on Madrid, and the distant murmur of the city accompanied him as his thoughts organized themselves into a plan, one that required constancy and humility, but that could, at last, lead him to the reconciliation he so longed for. That night, as he got ready to sleep, his phone remained silent. There was no reply from Isabel. However, that lack of a reply did not discourage him. He knew that sometimes words take time to find their moment, and that patience would be his best ally. Outside, the moon appeared between the clouds, dimly lighting the wet streets, and in his mind, the echo of Enrique's voice kept repeating, "Don't let any more time pass." What do you think of Alejandro's approach of showing up unannounced in Toledo? Is it a bold, sincere move, or an intrusive one? Mending the past, the morning of that Sunday dawned luminous, with a clear sky and a fresh breeze that swept through the narrow streets of Toledo. Isabel was in the courtyard of the cultural center, reviewing some plans with 2 volunteers. The scent of jasmine and the murmur of the fountain's water created a peaceful atmosphere. However, inside, she was restless. Since her meeting with Alejandro days earlier, old emotions were mixing with a steely caution. She didn't want to allow a sudden illusion to disrupt the balance she had worked so hard to build. Alejandro, for his part, had gotten up early to prepare a surprise visit. In the car, he carried several boxes of materials he had obtained through a contact in Madrid, donated books, paints, brushes, and tools for restoring furniture. During the trip to Toledo, he mentally rehearsed what he was going to say. He didn't seek to impress with grand gestures, but to show genuine interest in the projects that were important to her. He arrived at the cultural center shortly before noon. The building, an old manor house of stone and wood, retained its original facade, although the interior was in full renovation. As he entered through the gate, he was greeted by the echo of voices and the metallic sound of tools. Isabel, seeing him, frowned slightly, surprised but not showing displeasure. She asked him what he was doing there. Alejandro smiled shyly and pointed to the boxes in his hands. He explained that they were donations for the center, that he had thought they might be useful for the cultural activities and workshops they organized. Isabel hesitated for an instant, but agreed to let him leave them in the storage room. While guiding him through the building, she told him about the restoration process. She showed him the library, where empty shelves waited to be filled with books, and the main hall, where scaffolding hung to repair the frescoed ceiling. Alejandro listened carefully, asking sincere questions about every detail. He wasn't trying to impose his opinion. He just wanted to understand and learn. At one point, one of the volunteers asked him for help moving a heavy piece of furniture. Alejandro, without hesitation, rolled up his shirt sleeves and helped. The gesture did not go unnoticed by Isabel, who was watching him from the corner of her eye. In the past, he would have considered that a waste of time, delegating any manual labor. Now, he seemed to enjoy it. After placing the furniture, he wiped the sweat from his forehead and smiled. And in that instant, Isabel felt a spark of something she thought was gone. They decided to take the break and went out to the courtyard. They sat on a stone bench with glasses of fresh horchata that one of the collaborators had brought them. Alejandro took the opportunity to talk about a memory from his childhood, how his grandmother used to organize family gatherings where everyone helped prepare food and fix up the house. He confessed that he had forgotten that sense of community and that, seeing Isabel work with her team, he had recovered it. Isabel listened with an attentive expression, but without committing with words. The calm was broken when one of the volunteers came in a hurry, saying there was a problem with a beam in the main hall. Alejandro and Isabel went together. The ceiling showed a crack that hadn't been there the last time they checked. Alejandro, remembering some notions of architecture he had learned in his work, proposed shoring up the area provisionally to prevent a collapse. With the help of others, he improvised a support and secured the structure. The tension dissipated when they confirmed that the immediate risk was under control. This practical action strengthened his position with the others. One of the volunteers commented that Alejandro seemed to know the trade, and he replied that he was only willing to learn and help. Isabel didn't say it out loud, but inside, she recognized that Alejandro's attitude was far from the distant and self-centered man she had known in the last years of their marriage. At the end of the day, Isabel offered to accompany her to a small neighborhood tavern, where she used to go to eat with the volunteers. The place, with whitewashed walls and wooden tables, was full of the aroma of homemade stew. They shared a plate of stewed partridge and freshly baked bread. The conversation was more fluid than ever. Alejandro talked about his current work, about how it had changed his way of understanding success. Isabel, in turn, shared anecdotes about the project, including some frustrations. As they ate, an elderly couple from a nearby table greeted them. It turned out they were Isabel's neighbors, and they congratulated her on the center's work. As they said goodbye, they commented that they were happy to see Isabel accompanied. That comment left both of them in a brief silence, broken by a shy smile. When they left the tavern, the sun was beginning to set, tinging the stone facades with gold. Alejandro accompanied her back to the cultural center to pick up her car. At the entrance, they stopped for a moment. Alejandro thanked her for letting him participate in the day's work. Isabel, after a pause, told him that she had appreciated his help, although she still didn't know how far she wanted to allow him to get involved. Alejandro accepted that answer without pushing. Before getting into his car, Isabel handed him a folder with information about the center's upcoming activities. She told him that, if he really wanted to help, he could start by attending one of the open community meetings. It was an invitation, although disguised as a task. Alejandro took it as a positive sign. On the way back to Madrid, he drove with the feeling that little by little, the walls that separated them were cracking. It wasn't a fast path, but it was a steady one. In his mind, he reviewed the images of that day. Isabel smiling faintly while they moved the furniture, the freshness of the horchata in the courtyard, the unspoken trust in the moment of securing the beam. Everything was part of a new chapter that was just beginning to be written. That night, upon arriving home, he left the keys on the table and turned on a warm lamp. He poured himself a glass of wine and opened the folder Isabel had given him. As he read the dates and activities, he thought that this time he would not let pride or distraction keep him from what really mattered. Outside, the city breathed calmly, and inside Alejandro, something like hope was beginning to take firm root. What do you think is the significance of Isabel's small gestures, like letting Alejandro help or giving him the folder? And what do they reveal about her feelings? A family reborn, the Sunday morning dawned covered by a soft light, filtered by the low clouds that seemed to envelop Toledo in a gray veil. Isabel was in her kitchen preparing coffee and toast when the doorbell rang unexpectedly. Opening the door, she found Alejandro with an expression of nervousness and determination. In his hands, he carried a thick folder and a paper bag with something that gave off a warm aroma. Without waiting for an invitation, though with a respectful tone, he told her they needed to talk, and that he had brought freshly made churros from the churreria in the square. Isabel hesitated for an instant, but ended up stepping aside to let him in. In the dining room, he placed the bag on the table and served the coffee, which was already ready. The scene had a strange naturalness, as if the past and present had met at a midpoint. Alejandro opened the folder and began to show her documents, budgets, and proposals for the final restoration of the cultural center's library. He had spoken with local architects and sought private grants. Isabel watched him as he explained every detail. It wasn't just the content that caught her attention, but the calm and sincere tone with which he did it. During the conversation, Alejandro mentioned that he had recovered old letters from his grandfather, which spoke of the value of caring for what unites people. He said that had made him reflect on his mistakes and on what he truly wanted to build. Isabel, although touched by his words, maintained a certain emotional distance. She had learned to protect herself and didn't want promises to remain just words. At that moment, Isabel's landline phone rang. It was Carmen, one of the center's volunteers, who, with an agitated voice, announced that an incident had occurred. Apparently, a heavy rain during the night had caused leaks in a room where they stored old documents. Isabel got up immediately, and without thinking, Alejandro offered to accompany her. They went out into the street and walked quickly to the center, dodging puddles and greeting neighbors who were opening their shop shutters. When they arrived, they found 3 volunteers trying to move file boxes to keep them from getting wetter. Alejandro rolled up his shirt sleeves and began to help, carrying heavy items and coordinating the work. Isabel noticed that his presence was not an obstacle, but a real help. As they protected the documents with plastic sheets, the rain beat hard against the windows, and the smell of damp paper filled the room. It was a job of almost 2 hours, which ended with everyone soaked but satisfied to have saved most of the material. After the effort, Isabel suggested they go to the corner cafe, a small place with marble tables and walls decorated with old photographs of Toledo. There, between the aroma of freshly ground coffee and the murmur of other conversations, Alejandro spoke about something more personal. He confessed that he had been afraid to face his own son, fearing rejection for the years of his absence. He said he was looking for a way to get closer without invading his life. Isabel listened in silence, knowing that this was an important step. She recommended that he start with small gestures, without expecting immediate results. The conversation turned to shared memories. They laughed as they recalled anecdotes from past trips, and in the middle of that laughter, there was a moment of stillness in which their eyes met in a different way. It was a complicity that had been buried, but still had roots. Isabel, however, forced herself to remember that trust is earned with time and actions, not with a single morning of effort. Returning to the cultural center to supervise that everything was in order, they found a group of children participating in a painting workshop. One of them approached Alejandro and showed him a drawing of the main square, proud of his work. Alejandro knelt to congratulate him and asked if he would like to paint together one day. Isabel, observing that scene, felt a lump in her throat. In the Alejandro of that moment, there was something genuinely paternal that she didn't remember seeing before. At the end of the afternoon, as the sky began to clear, Isabel and Alejandro walked together along the bank of the Tagus River. The water reflected the golden tones of the setting sun, and the damp air smelled of fresh earth. They walked in silence for several minutes, until Alejandro thanked her for allowing him to be present on such a significant day. Isabel, in a calm voice, told him that it wasn't a matter of allowing or not, but of letting his actions speak for him. Before saying goodbye in front of Isabel's doorway, Alejandro handed her a small notebook. Inside, he had noted dates for upcoming cultural events and a handwritten note. "I want to be here when you need me." Isabel didn't reply immediately. She put the notebook in her coat pocket and looked at him with a mix of caution and recognition. Then, with a brief nod, she said goodbye and closed the door softly. Alejandro stood for a moment in front of the house, feeling that every step he took to repair the past was also a step toward a future he didn't know if he would get, but was determined to seek. He walked through the cobbled streets of Toledo, now lit by streetlights, with the feeling that the day, though exhausting, had left a mark that would not be easily erased. That night, Isabel sat at her desk, took out the notebook, and opened it. She reread the note, her fingers tracing the handwriting, and then closed it with a long sigh. Outside, the city slept, but inside her, a question remained awake. Was it possible that someone who had hurt her so much could, with time and constancy, become part of her life again? The morning in Toledo dawned with a clear sky and a fresh air that announced the beginning of spring. The city was preparing for the Corpus Christi festivities, and the streets were beginning to be decorated with flowers, colorful awnings, and carpets of dyed sawdust. Isabel, from her house window, watched the movement in the square. That day, she had decided to accompany her son, Javier, to a photography exhibition at the Cultural Center. She knew Alejandro would be there, as he was one of the event's sponsors, but she hadn't wanted to mention it so as not to influence her son's mood. When they arrived, the hall was full of visitors, and the murmur of conversations mingled with the soft music from a string quartet. The walls were covered with black and white images that portrayed everyday scenes of life in Castilla-La Mancha. Javier, with his camera around his neck, stopped to look attentively at each photograph, asking the author technical questions. Isabel watched him with pride, admiring his curiosity and sensitivity. At one point, Alejandro approached from the side, greeting them with a polite smile. He addressed Javier first, asking him what he thought of the exhibition. The young man replied cautiously, but without hostility, commenting that he liked the images that showed rural life. Alejandro took the opportunity to tell him that one of the most striking photos had been taken on the estate where he had grown up. Javier listened in silence, and although he didn't smile, he didn't move away either. Isabel perceived a small, barely perceptible, but important step forward. As they walked through the room, Carmen, the center's volunteer, joined them, commenting that a small tasting of typical products had been set up in the back patio. They all went out together, finding tables covered with white tablecloths and trays of manchego cheese, Iberian ham, and glasses of local red wine. Alejandro poured a glass for Isabel and another for Javier, who accepted it with a brief gesture. The midday sun fell on the patio, illuminating their faces and creating a warm and festive atmosphere. It was in that environment that an old man, Don Ramon, a neighbor and friend of the family, approached to say hello. In a loud voice, he asked Alejandro if he had already talked to his son about those pending matters. The silence that followed was awkward. Javier frowned, looking at his mother, who in turn was looking at Alejandro, waiting for a response. Alejandro, somewhat uncomfortable, explained that Don Ramon was referring to the story of the library and the broken promises from years ago. Javier, in a serious tone, replied that promises are worth little if they are not kept. The tension could be cut with a knife. To break the moment, Isabel suggested that everyone return to the main hall, where a charity auction of photographs would begin to finance cultural activities. Javier, still serious, agreed to accompany them. During the auction, Alejandro surprised everyone by bidding generously for a photograph that showed the view of Toledo at sunset. When the auctioneer's hammer struck, he turned to Javier and handed him the work, saying he wanted him to have it as a symbol of new beginnings. The young man took the painting with a confused expression, not knowing whether to thank him or question the gesture. Leaving the event, Alejandro proposed taking them both to lunch at a nearby restaurant with views of the Tagus River. Isabel hesitated, but Javier accepted, perhaps out of curiosity. On the restaurant's terrace, while the waiter brought plates of manchegan migas and cod with garlic and olive oil, the conversation became more personal. Alejandro spoke of his mistakes with frankness, without excuses, and confessed that for years he had been led by pride and ambition, forgetting the essentials. He said that his priority now was to rebuild bridges, even if he didn't know how long it would take or if it would be entirely possible. Javier, looking at the river from the terrace, asked what guarantee he had that he wouldn't disappear again. Alejandro took his time before replying that there were no absolute guarantees, only facts and consistency. Isabel watched them both, feeling that the conversation was a crucial, albeit fragile, step. The waiter served a typical dessert, toccinillo de cielo, and the atmosphere softened slightly. There was even a moment when Javier made an ironic comment, and Alejandro smiled without being offended. After lunch, they walked together along the promenade that bordered the river, where the shadows of the trees created a mosaic of light on the ground. Alejandro told an anecdote from his childhood, when he had fallen into the river while trying to catch a fish, and how his own father had rescued him. It was a simple story, but it suggested that he too had known the value of family protection. Javier said nothing, but Isabel noticed that he was listening intently. When they returned to the square, the decorations for the festival were almost finished. The flags waved in the wind, and the scent of fresh flowers filled the air. Alejandro said goodbye with a handshake and a brief kiss on the cheek for Isabel. He thanked them for the shared time and promised to stop by the library the next day to help with the preparations for a children's event. Javier, although he didn't give his explicit approval, didn't reject the proposal either. That night, Isabel thought about the small gestures of the day. There were no grand declarations, but there were signs of a real change. Inside, she knew that the road was still long and full of uncertainties. But for the first time in a long time, she felt that perhaps there was a possibility that the wound was beginning to heal. Outside, the city lights came on, and the murmur of neighbors preparing for the festival filled the air with a sense of community and hope. The morning in Toledo began with a warm sun that illuminated the ancient facades and made the cobblestones of the streets shine. The air was filled with the aroma of freshly baked bread coming from the bakeries and a constant murmur of preparation, as a special meeting was to be held in the Plaza Mayor that afternoon to close the festivities. Isabel woke up early, more serene than in recent months. She felt that that day would mark a before and after. She had prepared a small speech to read at the end of the meeting, in which she would thank the community for its support and her family for the steps taken towards reconciliation. In Javier's house, the atmosphere was also different. There was no longer that dense silence that had accompanied him for years. Carmen ate toast with jam while her father reviewed notes in a notebook. Alejandro had spent the night there for the first time since everything began, sleeping in the guest room. It wasn't planned, but the result of a long conversation the night before, in which, between memories and confessions, they had lost track of time. That morning, Alejandro offered to make coffee for everyone, and although the gesture was simple, for Javier, it had the weight of a renewed commitment. In mid-morning, the three of them headed toward the square. The cobblestones were decorated with garlands and tables set up to share food. Neighbors arrived with tortillas, empanadas, cured cheeses, and bottles of local wine. Don Ramon, as a good host, supervised that everything was in order. Seeing them arrive together, he smiled and commented that this was how he had always wanted to see them, united. During the first hour, the atmosphere was festive. Children ran around with balloons, groups of friends toasted with glasses of cider, and in a corner, a guitar played accompanied by clapping. Isabel took the opportunity to talk to Marta, the woman who had found Alejandro's mother's letter. She thanked her again for the gesture and confessed that the letter had been a catalyst for opening a dialogue that had seemed impossible. Marta replied that sometimes the past is not a chain, but a key, if one knows how to look at it differently. When the time came, Isabel went up to the small, improvised stage to give her speech. She spoke of the importance of community, of how wounds could heal if there was a will, and that family was not always united by blood, but by acts and mutual care. Her words were met with sincere applause. Then Javier was given the floor, who, in a slightly nervous but firm voice, said that he had learned that forgiving was not forgetting, but deciding to move forward without carrying bitterness. Finally, Alejandro took the microphone. There was an expectant silence. He admitted his mistakes. He spoke of the absences that should never have happened, and promised that, from now on, his priority would be to take care of his own. When he finished, the three of them hugged before the emotional gaze of those present. The music returned to fill the square. Some began to dance sevillanas. Others approached to try the dishes arranged on the tables. Alejandro took it upon himself to serve wine to the older neighbors, while Javier helped set up some chairs for a group of elderly women who wanted to sit in the shade. Isabel, meanwhile, chatted with a group of young people who wanted to organize more cultural activities. An air of renewed community was breathed. As evening fell, the sky was tinged with orange and pink tones. Streetlights were lit, softly illuminating the square. A group of musicians began to play popular songs that invited a sing-along. Alejandro and Javier, without planning it, found themselves next to each other watching the sunset. There was a moment of silence between them, broken only by Javier, who said that maybe it was time to stop counting the bad days and start building good ones. Alejandro nodded and replied that although he couldn't change the past, he could decide every step of the future. Before the celebration concluded, Don Ramon asked for a final toast. They raised their glasses, and he, in a clear voice, said that there is no family without stumbles, but there is also no family without attempts to get up together. The toast was followed by a general applause. Carmen, with her broad smile, hugged her father and her uncle at the same time, joining their hands as if she never wanted them to separate again. When the lights began to go out and the neighbors gradually left, Isabel, Alejandro, and Javier walked together down the cobblestone street toward home. They passed in front of the illuminated cathedral, whose walls seemed to hold centuries of stories of loss and reunion. Isabel felt that, in some way, they were now part of that silent tradition of second chances. Upon arriving home, Alejandro stopped for a moment before entering. He looked at his son and his niece and said he wanted to stay that night too, to help prepare breakfast together the next day. Javier, without hesitation, said that the door was open. There were no grand gestures or solemn promises, but in that instant, everyone knew that the real change was not in the words spoken in the square, but in those everyday moments that were beginning to be shared again. That night, while the last echoes of the party died down in the streets, a warm light remained on in that house in Toledo, a symbol of a home that, after so long, was once again beating in unison. And although they knew that there would still be challenges, they all knew that the important thing was to walk together, because the true strength of a family is not measured in what is never broken, but in what is rebuilt again and again. The gentle breeze of Toledo seemed to carry away the last echoes of laughter and music as the streets returned to their usual calm. The warm lights that remained on in some windows recalled that beyond the festivities, what was important had happened inside their hearts. After so many wounds and silences, those steps taken together in the square had sealed a new commitment, not based on grand promises, but on the daily will to care for and listen to each other. It was as if, after a long winter, spring had returned not only to the city, but also to a home that had been in shadows for too long. Deep down, the lesson that remained was simple and eternal. True love is not just feeling, it is repairing. And family is not measured by the absence of conflicts, but by the strength to rebuild what once seemed broken. Just like a lamp lit by the window on a dark night, a sincere gesture of reconciliation can guide the way back, even for those who thought there was no turning back. Today, as each person returns to their routines, there is a certainty that second chances are not found. They are built with patience and humility. Perhaps it is worth it for each of us to look around and recognize those small acts of affection that sustain us, because they are the ones that, without making a sound, keep the invisible fabric that defines us together. If this story has touched a chord in your memory or your present, share it with those you love, so we don't forget that it is always possible to mend a bridge, because, in the end, life is more like a square than a wall, a place where we can all meet again if we have the courage to approach. What do you think is the most important lesson Alejandro learned from this journey? What would you do differently if you were in his situation?